You need to keep that as the opening for the show.
Oh, it's totally going to be the opening. Hi, Mates of the Podcast fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson. And today, back in the interviewee chair, we have Josh Heath, author, writer, editor, proofreader, author. Josh, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing really well.
This is one of our episodes in the Worlds of Darkness series, where Josh and I are going to be talking about Mage Werewolf crossovers. And I was mentioning to Josh before the show, Werewolf is one of the supplements I know the least about. I have 24 books about it, and I just don't get werewolf. Josh, what's a werewolf?
Well, a werewolf, Terry, is a giant furry monster that at the same time is all about spirituality and fighting, destroying, and killing everything in the world.
I think I met that guy at college. Do they smell bad? Like, how do we... in my head, werewolf is like, hey, White Wolf made a game for people who peaked in high school who are now really into CrossFit.
Here's the essential thing, Terry.
Okay.
Werewolf is a game that is a series of dichotomies and irrationalities mixed together and packaged as a single unified vision. It can be so many different types of games that, yes, it can be the, hey, we're just a bunch of jocks getting together playing a beat-em-up game. That is one way of playing Werewolf the Apocalypse. Or it can be a game about family. It can be a game about the environment, which is really, I think, what the creators were going for was a game about protecting the environment without being Captain Planet, but protecting the environment through militant environmentalism. Or it can be a game about spirituality and trying to save your spirituality against a world that doesn't believe it should exist any longer.
It sounds like the recurring theme is the idea of, I feel like this word has been kind of destroyed in terms of modernity, but purity?
On some level, yes.
That it could be represented community-wise or environmentally or personally. That seems to be what all these arrows are pointing towards in terms of a big theme. And the tension, I guess, between them?
Yeah. I think purity, but also, because that's a bad word, in some cases, that yes, but all the bad things that come with that goal. Let me ask you this question. What would you say is the essential question or the essential horror in Mage, the Ascension?
I guess the essential horror to me is that of true existentialism. I have infinite possibility. What do I do with it? And do I dare have the bravery to shout my will upon the universe? And am I willing to deal with the ramifications of that? In my more recent chronicles, I've been big on the idea when you push the world pushes back. It just so happens that mages don't skip arm day. Sorry, this analogy just kind of fell off. But yeah, you influence reality. Reality will influence you. And the choice of whether or not to do that and the question of hubris versus enlightenment to me is, I guess, the horror of it, the realization of freedom.
I think that's how a hubris, which is where I was hoping you would go, is what I've always seen as the essential question of Mage, is the sense of, yes, I can change the world, but who am I to decide that my vision of the world is the right vision of the world? That is an element in Werewolf as well, but in the sense of, we believe that this way of being is healthiest for the world and all of humanity, and we think it's so healthy that we will kill everything to get it that healthy, with all of the problems of fascism that can lean into, but also a sense of righteousness in some ways becoming zealotry. And how do you balance those on the spear's edge?
The messy part to me when I hear that, though, is it hubris if a person believes they hear a higher power whispering into their ear and then they act on it? In Werewolf, in the Cosmology, the werewolves are the warriors of Gaia. Like, literally the incarnation of the spirit of the earth has given them their mission. How could there ever be doubt that they are doing it correctly? Mage has no analog. Like, there is no sorting hat. Like, Gandalf doesn't say, like, this is your mission. In most cases, you're brought into a tradition. You see all the other traditions. It seems like the right-wrong dichotomy and the question of hubris is kind of removed because of that in Werewolf. Does it still creep in, or is Gaia silent in this matter, I guess?
Oh, absolutely. Here's the interesting thing is that werewolves believe that Gaia has given them this mission, but if you read thousands of werewolf books like somebody here has, and other people just like do over time, is like Gaia hasn't spoken to the werewolves directly in thousands of years. If she has, it's through an avatar of her, and she is usually giving like a specific set of guidance to a pack or even maybe like a single werewolf. This idea that they have this specific mission is completely, it's religious in nature without a lot of substantive strength behind it. It's just a lot of reinforcement of culture that's happened without a lot of actual like spiritual direction for it.
So it sounds like they're kind of the anarcho-primitive Amish in the sense that they believe they've received the true message, or there are people within their midst that believe they have received the true message. Some people disagree with that. There's nothing recent they can point to say that they're right, except for maybe we've always done it this way. Look at the world around you. It's terrible. The more we can contrast with that, obviously, the better. We should keep to our community and fight the fight the way it is. Is that a reasonable... And one of the differences among the groups is going to be the degree to which they believe or don't believe in that. If that's reasonably accurate, is there a scripture or a holy text or a set of guiding principles for werewolves? Like, Mage doesn't really have one. You kind of get it from your tradition. In Vampire, you may have the traditions, or if you're the Sabbat, completely ignore them. With Wraith, you have the Dictum Mortuum or something like that. Is there a set of quote-unquote core beliefs that maybe not even everyone observes?
And that's a really excellent question. There are two that come to mind. The litany is the first one, obviously. The litany being the perceived guidance from Gaia, or in some books, the Garou nation's decisions on what the set of rules that should drive the nation as a whole. And you have, I want to say it's 13 points of the litany, but I could actually be wrong and not be remembering the number correctly. It doesn't matter. But yes, that is one set of rules that says, like, we should be doing this. These are the rules that Garou society follows. And also the prophecy of the Phoenix, which is slightly more recent in Garou history, but it is a prophecy about the end of times, about the apocalypse, which is the whole thing with Werewolf. With those two things, those are the guidelines that Garou all sort of like, they're trying to avoid the apocalypse by using the litany, by following the litany, but that's something that it's very subjective, tribe to tribe, or even pack to pack, or Garou to Garou. Okay,
so we've gotten kind of an intro. We dove in. Let's get some definitions. Garou Nation, what's that? Pack, what's that? Tribe, what's that?
So the Garou Nation are kind of like the 9 traditions. They are the grouping of werewolves, Garou being werewolves. That's their in-culture term for themselves. They have 13 tribes, at one point more than that. And the current 13 tribes make up the nation of the Garou. Are all those the terms we need to define?
The last one was pack, and so are Garou strictly werewolves? Like, I've seen that there are other changing breeds. Some of the Mage books make reference to Korax, and recently there was a supplement on Drive-Thru RPG for Weretrout that I'm super jazzed to eventually buy. Is there a term for just those? Like, you mentioned the 9 traditions. Is there a technocracy? Is there a bad guy? Do the Nefandi, do the bad werewolves have a separate term? Are the Garou just the good guys, or is it just all werewolves?
So that's a great question and hard to answer directly. So yes, Garou refer to any werewolves, even the bad werewolves. There are a group of bad werewolves called the Black Spiral Dancers, who used to be a tribe in the nation, but they were foolish and decided to do something that got them turned to the side of the Wyrm. The Wyrm being that force of oblivion that the Nefandi may or may not have a connection to in Mage. So the cosmology of Mage and Werewolf are actually very similar. This sense of dynamism, static energy, and corruptive energies exist in the same way in Werewolf. The Wyrm, the Weaver, the Wild. Those cognates exist in both cosmologies. That said, there are other changing breeds as well that serve Gaia in different ways, and those are called the Fera by the werewolves. Those are the Korax, the Nuisha, the Bastet, the Makole, the Rokea, the Naga, the Gronder, the Apis, the Ananasi, and I just did the Ratkin, and I think I did all the major ones off the top of my head, and I'm very proud of myself.
Yes. You just started listing members of the Wu-Tang Clan at some point. You're like, irate Swami. I'm like, I'm on to you. Those aren't were-breeds. And are they all large carnivores or omnivores? The only known exception I have, and this is because of how often I get lost on the White Wolf Wiki, you have Apis, which are what, the were-oronks?
Yes.
Or something like that? Did you mention Rokea?
I did mention the Rokea, the were-sharks, yes.
The Grawl? How the heck do you pronounce that? Werebears.
Garal. Yeah, werebears.
Good to know. And there are like 900 different kinds of Bastet. Is this also another game where there's the exact same thing but multiplied by 10 for East Asia?
Interestingly enough, and the one I missed, the one
Kitsune.
changing breed I missed were the Kitsune. Yep. Otherwise, all the other changing breeds exist in Asia as the Henge Yokai or the Beast Courts.
And do they all get along?
Yes, and that's another Orientalist trope and problem.
Okay, got it. Is there a East versus West mentality there at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Good.
And they literally have gifts that are like heaven punching power.
Nice. Is that literally what it's called?
There's literally one that's called heaven punching power. Yes.
Oh, interesting. So you had argued before this call that Werewolf was secretly not just exalted for furries, but you're really not.
Then there's the Henge Yokai book.
Yeah, you're really not convincing me here. So you've given a basic outline, and like in my head, werewolves are effing tanks. You're like, I think during character creation you start with 14 dots in strength and then just go up from there. Is that true?
No.
Okay.
So you do get increases to your abilities when you shift forms, but not high compared to some of the other World of Darkness splats, but not ridiculously high. The average Garu in Krynos form gets +4 strength, which if you're a 5 strength character, sure, you're going to have 9 dots in strength to begin with when you're in your between wolf and between man form, which is your war form, which is called Krynos. But that doesn't mean you can just go out and destroy everything that you see. You can destroy a lot of things, but not everything that you would encounter.
Okay, you've mentioned Krynos, so stereotypically, full moon, werewolf's gonna wear, but that would be a really lame game if your character spent like 27 days being human and 1 day being murder machine. So what is the role of changing to the werewolf?
That is one of the spiritual elements, interestingly enough, of werewolves, is that they view themselves as the children of two celestial beings, Gaia, the earth, and Luna, the moon. And Luna gifts and or curses werewolves with this sense of fury that her or his, depending on the different genders used, that their mate, Gaia, is being harmed. And that anger, that righteous anger that they are given by Luna, is represented by different moon phases. And moon phases and the different forms that werewolves change into have overlap, don't have overlap. They're actually not directly connected, but the phase of your moon that you're born under does have an impact on the amount of rage or furious righteous anger that you have access to as a game statistic.
So, strength of 9 merely allows you to punch through a cement wall. You're right, they're really not that much of a tank. Except for the part where they can punch through a cement wall.
From a relative to mage standpoint, yes, they're distinctly stronger than the average human. But mages have an advantage where they can get out of the way and do magic against them.
Yeah, that's notable. I don't imagine that there's some magical way that a werewolf can just step sideways into another realm to escape from harm or something like that. So
interesting that you bring that up.
You've brought up the idea that they have this very spirit-based cosmology, that they are the child of two beings of incredible potence. Do they have another world? Vampires tend not to go into the Umbra. Wraiths are completely stuck there. Changeling have this weird thing that's kind of in between in the form of the Dreaming, which they may or may not visit. Mage, it's entirely Chronicle dependent. Is there another world for werewolves, and what is their relationship with it?
So werewolves have access to the Umbra, just as mages do, or some mages do. And the Umbra is incredibly important to a werewolf campaign in such a way that it's unlikely you'll ever have a werewolf game that doesn't have some time spent in the Umbra. You're right about mage. Some mage campaigns, you'll never interact with the Umbra or any umbral beings, and that's fine. I'm running a mage game right now where none of my players have enough spirit to enter or interact with the Umbra. But a werewolf game, any werewolf at character creation is able to step into the spirit world and travel and destroy spirits with the goal of ultimately cleansing the world both spiritually and physically.
You mentioned that the spirit world, do they have access to all three Umbrae? Do they have access to the penumbra? Is it like, am I doing a bad job as a storyteller if I have my mages in the Umbra and they're not constantly running into werewolves?
No, because there aren't as many werewolves as you would think there would be.
Okay.
So yes, werewolves have access to all layers of the Umbra, sort of. They don't naturally go into the Dark Umbra, though it is possible. There are gifts that allow them to do so. The Silent Striders, which is a tribe of werewolves, have a stronger connection because they're horribly haunted by vampire things, that's an entire episode that we'll be doing on Werewolf Podcast soon. Suffice it to say, werewolves spend a lot of time in the Umbra, but the Umbra is very dangerous.
So it sounds like they spend a lot of time in the middle Umbra then, or am I going to run into werewolves in the Vulgate and the Spires and the Epiphanes?
You can, but werewolves tend to go to different places when they go to the deep Umbra. So it's possible, but again, they generally go to their side of the Umbra, which is kind of a terrible way of describing it.
Noted. In fact, storytellers out there, if you would like a comical number of Gafflings, Janglings, Incarna, Celestines, and so on to populate your Umbra, I strongly recommend you look into Werewolf as a way of fleshing that out. If you want weird spider creatures to destroy your players at every turn, boy howdy, they probably have entire books of them.
They shockingly have one called Book of the Weaver, which is pretty much all of that.
So you mentioned the Weaver and the Metaphysical Trinity. Are all were creatures aligned with the wild?
No. Here's where things get really weird. The wild is the creative force of the universe, right? The dynamic force that exists in both of the games. Mm-hmm. Werewolves, for some reason, see themselves as connected to that force. But it's very confusing why. Because that force is completely impersonal and has no consciousness the same way that maybe the Weaver and the Wyrm do. And the Weaver essentially is the force that has structured everything within the world. I could go off on a tangent about my thoughts of who actually created the Garu and all of that. But to suffice it to say, there's at least one changing breed that sees themselves as Weaver spawn, and it is the insectoid or the arachnid species, the Ananase.
What's your pet theory? If it turns out to be super lame, I just cut it.
My pet theory is that Gaia was actually created by the Weaver. So some of the werewolf cosmology gets confusing, where they describe Gaia as having created the triad, which doesn't make sense to me. Because the triad have to exist first for a form for creation to be made. And this does potentially dovetail into Exalted and some of the connections that they excised in Exalted lore. But for creation to exist, it has to be formed. And that form happens from the Weaver. It doesn't happen from the wild. So why would werewolves feel a connection to the unformed wild that is essentially just trying to remake and not destroy, but like constantly generate new things and doesn't care about them? That's the part that I've always been really confused about. It's more like the Weaver's like, hey, creation is good. I'm going to create things that protect my creation from all of these other forces from the Wyrm and from the wild, essentially.
That seems entirely reasonable. I guess it sounds like one of those arguments of what came first. The cosmological relationship you're outlining seems very much more personal than what a mage may experience. I have a feeling that the forces of dynamism, even to a marauder, is going to be the idea versus this entity. When you refer to things like Gaia and Luna, is that an intellectualization, or do werewolves actually think that out there is this Luna entity?
Here's where things get really weird from a werewolf perspective.
Bring it.
Everything that exists in the universe has a platonic ideal embodiment. Luna exists as a physical being in the Umbra, a physical / incredibly powerfully spiritual being. All of the planets in the universe have this avatar that exists in the Umbra that is a physical thing that they can go and visit. Even Rorg, the former planet that is now the asteroid belt, exists as a physical being that werewolves can journey out into the astral realm to go and visit. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read Rage Across the Heavens or Rage Across Heaven. I don't know if there's a "the" there, but it is a fantastic book that outlines a very weird story that you can bring players into.
And is this something that a mage just doesn't have access to, or the mages don't care about, I guess? So we've now outlined a few cases where mages and werewolves could overlap. I could certainly see a werewolf viewing a mage as either an intruder on the nature of the reality, or alternatively more pure than the rest of humanity, or what have you. They spend time in the Umbra. Is there a resource that they're fighting over? Is there a territory that they fight each other for? When is a mage going to be running into a werewolf?
Let me ask you this instead, which I think all of those are good questions and questions we should address. But if you were to create a mage that was interested in the Umbra, what types of mages would you think would be appropriate for having that sort of umbral connection?
I would say there would be 3 wildly disparate directions I would go. One would be Void Engineer, easiest. High tech, let's explore space. 2, I guess the stereotype would be Dream Speaker, someone entering it that way. And 3rd, I'll ignore the digital web, because otherwise, kind of necessity, almost all virtual adepts are going to be spending some time there. And I guess the 3rd would probably be Hermetics, maybe with a chance of the SOE if we're talking about like the Deep Umbra or the Hollow Earth. But those would kind of be my, of people to get off the rock, as it were, those would be probably my first 3 choices.
Interesting. I think all 3 of those are ones that come to mind for me as well, but I also see the Verbena and the Euthanatoi and maybe the Akashics coming at it from a different angle. Cult of Ecstasy could as well, if you think about vision quests and things like that, and what all of that might mean if they travel into the astral realm.
So everyone but the hollowed ones in the Celestial Course. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
We've narrowed it down to 80% of them.
But the thing is that any mage can, if that
got it.
is part of their paradigm. But I think you tie into the 3 tradition/conventions that most people would go to right away. The Dream Speakers being the fairly obvious ones, only because the whole structure of the Dream Speakers is this. It's in sync from a writing perspective. I don't think it's actually culturally in sync, but in sync from a writing perspective with werewolf cosmology.
Are werewolves fundamentally animistic in the same way? Do they consider all things possessed by a spirit, or just these giant entities like the moon?
Everything has a spirit for werewolves. So they are completely animist in that a rock has a spirit and will have a spiritual reflection in the Umbra that they can destroy or make friends with.
Yeah. The 2 sides of the rock.
Right.
Do they do that from the Umbra, or is that something where they're talking to light fixtures, a la what many Dream Speakers would do with Spirit 2, of not necessarily crossing the gauntlet, but talking to entities on the other side of it?
It depends on the type of Garu that you're talking about. Any Garu can step sideways and interact directly with the spirit. So that gives them that opportunity, but they can also, if you're a Theurge, which is one of the moon signs, they are the more spiritual of the spiritual Garu, in that their role is to be spirit talkers and to be, and I don't like the word shaman, but like medicine men and or spirit engagers. They're the ones that go out and work with the spirits directly. They can speak with them more successfully.
That's interesting, because in a context where literally everyone can, it almost makes them sound like they're the PR people for the werewolves to be like, oh, we burned down your house. This is Jim. He's going to walk you through the claims process. He takes you out to dinner first, something like that. But something tells me it may not be like that. I don't know.
It actually is not, but it's not far from that, in that, like, if a pack goes into the Umbra and kills a bunch of spirits, maybe the Theurge uses their gifts to be able to speak to the more powerful spirits in the area and say, I'm sorry that we had to do this, but this is why. So, yeah.
And are they accepted by spirits? Like, the dream speakers, in almost all cases, the foundation of that relationship is usually chiminage, that you have some sort of quid pro quo. I did a thing, now you do a thing. Or with the hermetics, they have these ancient agreements that they can invoke in terms of umbral lore. They find out true names and such. How is a Garu approaching a spirit?
So Garu are part spirit, and this is where it gets into some of the weirdness of what werewolves are. They are half spirit, half mortal being. So half either werewolf or human, but they are also half spirit. So because of that, spirits tend to view them a bit more positively to begin with, as in, oh, you are a fellow spirit. But just like dream speakers, they have to get something from most spirits. They have to make agreements and give gifts. It's a cycle of reciprocity, which is how most traditional societies, human societies, operate, is on a culture of reciprocity. And that is one of the things that both the dream speakers and werewolves are speaking to from a mirror of human society lens.
You've made mention to gifts. What is a gift?
A gift is a gift that a spirit has given a werewolf. And the werewolves use them like vampires use disciplines or mages use a rote. So it's a specific magic power that a Garu can enact. But it is called a gift because a spirit has taught it to them.
So what is then the source of that power? Is it the case where I get the gift of make this land grow corn or whatever, and I invoke that as a Garu? Is the power coming from me? Is it something woven into reality? Is that original spirit I have with the relationship? Who's actually doing the metaphysical lifting when a gift is enacted?
So here's a question for you that answers that.
Okay, Socrates, this is it's getting a bit messy.
When a dream speaker causes an effect to occur, how do they do so?
When is a raven like a writing desk? I'm onto you, Mr. Heath. I mean, it's gonna vary as per the effect. In some cases, if it's strictly spirit, it's going to be that chiminage. It's going to be a quid pro quo. In other cases, it's coming from the avatar systematically, regardless of what the mage kind of thinks is happening. They're using their willpower to adjust the warp and weft of reality to instantiate an effect brought to them through enlightened will.
I don't necessarily agree, but I think that is one angle to take.
You didn't give me the answer I wanted, but continuing on. So where is it coming from for you then?
So I would say from a dream speaker paradigm, it comes from the same place that a werewolf's gifts do. In that, when a dream speaker calls out to a specific spirit for a specific action, that spirit, regardless of if it's the mage's will forcing the spirit to do the action or the spirit doing it independently, that spirit is ultimately the reason the effect occurs.
Sure, in paradigm. Mm-hmm. Done.
Right.
Okay,
right.
Cool.
Though I agree with you from a mechanical standpoint. Yes.
Yeah, you're rolling your arete, not the spirits, right. Whatever spirits have.
Exactly. Werewolves, ultimately, what they do with their gifts is the spirit that gave them that power was the one that bestowed the ability to do that effect spiritually upon them. So it comes from the Garu, but ultimately the spirit that gave them the gift is responsible for the existence of that power.
But, okay, I guess the comparison is, if I learn a rote and the guy who taught me the rote dies or starts to hate me, I don't unlearn the rote. Is it possible to lose a gift because, like, you accidentally kicked the raccoon spirit that originally taught you the effect in the first place, or do you have that sweet knowledge?
It depends on the gift, because in most cases, the gifts become imprinted upon your soul.
Oh.
So you never not know how to do them, which allows things like abominations and black spiral dancers to still have Gaian gifts at times. But it is possible for a very powerful spirit to say, no, you don't have access to that anymore.
So we've talked about how a mage may run into a werewolf in the course of doing otherworldly stuff. What are cases where either on the mundane side or the umbral side, where the agenda of a werewolf or the agenda of a mage would come into contact with one another? Where's a case where my character says, hey, maybe we call upon the werebros, or where the werebros say, hey, we need to talk to the wizards?
So let me ask you this. What are the most important places in reality for mages to congregate around?
I'm going to go with Starbucks, but I think that's not the question you're asking. Nodes. That's kind of like first edition of Mage kind of set up the idea of the juice, as it were, and Mage is a fight for juice.
So if Mage is a fight for juice and Werewolf is a fight for the world that creates the juice points.
The right to lead your lacrosse team. Yeah, I understand.
Right. I would say that nodes / what Garu call cairns are a strong overlap point. But that said, they come at what these sources of power are very differently. And so that often becomes a combative relationship.
Cairns, is there a one-to-one relationship between a node and a cairn? Are all cairns nodes or all nodes cairns?
Yes.
That was just okay. So they're all, each one is the t'other. Because, like, for instance, a changeling freehold isn't necessarily a node, and likewise a wraithly haunt isn't necessarily a node, and vice versa. But in this case, it's two words for the same darn thing.
Correct.
Okay, so it sounds like there's probably some bad blood if both groups are kind of fighting over that same resource.
Yeah, and that's the problem for crossover between Mage and Werewolf, is that without the fight over nodes / cairns, they would probably get along a lot better. But because of that, there's very little. Garu don't like to share with each other, with anyone. They don't share well, which makes all of their problems even worse. And so when you find wizards controlling a place you consider holy, you're just going to be like, oh, we're going to go kill them, because sadly, that's their innate reaction for most things.
So it seems like a pretty straightforward thing. You can introduce a werewolf as an antagonist. Your group stumbles upon this kick-ass node that is strangely unattended in the middle of the forest. The Umbra, for whatever reason, is strangely silent, and only later do you find out that there was this group of Garu in this area that were completely wiped out defending it. The assaulting force died in the process, and they're like, bitch, what you doing here?
I think that plot line has been run 100 times that I've heard of, at least.
Okay,
yes.
So reliable. Is it ever the case where mages proactively try and kill off werewolves to get access to a node, or at least tradition mages? I could certainly see the technocracy wanting to wipe out a cairn regardless and sanitize it. But are cairns potent enough that mages would wage a war to get it? And do they have any chance of succeeding against the fang-encrusted murder machines?
There are at least 2 and maybe more times I can think of in the books where various tradition groups have gone after cairns in that way. Well, one was an Order of Hermes assault, and kind of like, we are taking this, where they were successful. But I think that happened either in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages. So it would have been at the height of their power. Okay. When they would have been more able to do so. There are other times where that's happened in more modern settings, but generally mages try really hard to negotiate with Garu when they can. Like, they're coming at things with a lot more level heads. So they try really hard at first to negotiate.
Is there a case where a mage and a werewolf would reasonably team up in, like, the buddy cop drama of, like, I don't like you and you don't like me, but if we're going to take down Smith at the end of the block, Like, do they ever cooperate? Do we have any history in the canon of the two groups cooperating to take out a common foe or what have you?
Beyond Chaos Factor, which we'll just ignore, though I don't want to because I love the Chaos Factor and Sam Hate and all of that.
An evil so potent that everyone cooperates with each other. I don't get it. Why is it that the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants is the only group that gets their shit together? And that's how you can tell that they're bad. Like, I am Lex Luthor, and I've brought you all together to ignore your petty bickerances so we can take out Superman. Like, what? Why is it the bad guys are the only ones that can come up with, like, a schedule to empty the dishwasher?
Valid question. But let me ask you this. Are you familiar with the Technocracy Special Projects Division?
SPD, yes. You answered yet another question with a question. I'm on to you.
What is the secret behind the Special Projects Division? Spoiler alert for anyone that doesn't want to listen to this part.
Oh, I mean, the SPD, what is it? It's Syndicate or aligned with the Syndicate, and they're dealing with stuff that they probably shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. And that spreads in all sorts of different directions. Right.
So to be clear about it for people listening, the Special Products Division is linked to a werewolf antagonist organization called Pentex. And Pentex is the Wyrm's, the evil influence in werewolf cosmology's organized corporation that's kind of like Captain Pollution or whatever his name was in Captain Planet, who's trying to take down the world through evil corporate excess.
Yeah, the guy who had like a suit entirely made out of extinct animals. Like, I will kill off all the dodos for my dodo golf shoes. Meh. You're like, that's a bit on the nose.
Interestingly enough, Werewolf does get into some like silliness like that at times.
Okay.
But I think my point, if I have one here, is that Special Products Division is a good crossover point in that there's this organization within the technocracy that is dealing with things that are nephandic or worm-tainted or really just not good for the world, ultimately. And I can easily see werewolves and tradition mages going, you know what? This is a common enemy for us. Let's take them out.
Noted. So we have evil version of Standard Oil, which is it ideologically aligned with the Wyrm, or quite literally does this cosmic entity have harbingers that act at the corporate level?
Quite literally.
Oh, okay. So this is very personified. This is very reified.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing with werewolf is that these all could be metaphors, but they're not, because the spirit is physical for werewolves. Because they can literally interact with that as if it were a physical thing. It takes all of those, this could just be metaphor, and makes it personified or rarefied. It gets silly at times, but it doesn't have to be.
That's part of the point, the straightforwardness of it. Mage is entirely a war of shadows, where it looks like, no, we can literally go up against what we know to be the personification of greed and corruption. Mm-hmm. And do the werewolves stand a chance against that?
Not a lick. That's the problem, not the problem, but like the fatal flaw of the Garu's mindset is that they are fighting an impossible to win war.
Now, is it impossible because of overwhelming odds, or are they just fighting it wrong? In the way that some people argue that the traditions could win the Ascension War if everyone cooperated, but if everyone cooperated, it would no longer have the dynamic aspect of it. Or is this bringing a knife to a gunfight, or alternatively bringing a gun to do your taxes, I guess would be a more apt miscomparison.
Yeah, I like the comparison of bringing a gun to do your taxes, actually.
Okay.
Because the books are not necessarily written this way, but my takeaway is always that the Garu are fighting a war that doesn't need to be fought. Insofar that if they were to look around and say, what was our role that Gaia gave us? It wasn't to kill everything in the world. It was to be her warriors, to fight specific battles. Oh, and hey, wait, there are these 18 other changing breeds, I just keep making more as time goes on, that all had other roles. If we actually worked with them and did the things that we were supposed to do, and we helped them do the things they were supposed to do, the world would be perfect. but they refuse to do that because they think they have the right answer to how the universe should exist. And in that way, they're very similar to the traditions who think, oh, this is the way things should be, and they can't get their shit together to work with other people that disagree.
Is there a group that does theoretically have the right answer that is maybe not being listened to, or is it a case where everyone is wrong?
That's a question that's impossible to answer with the canon material.
Okay, so the canon doesn't give you a material example of, in the same way that the traditions are quote unquote the good guys. It maybe isn't quite so straightforward in Werewolf. You know who it seems like Werewolf is a system where you know who the bad guys are, where maybe necessarily in Mage that's not the case, where you can have very sympathetic technomancers. I mean, we're all kind of agreed that the Nefandi are over the top, but I mean, there are many chronicles where they don't even factor in. But in Werewolf, the Wyrm is the Wyrm, and that's the bad guy. It's just that the good guys, no one can agree on how to deal with this, John.
Here's where things get really weird. Yeah, you're right. That's the way it's all written. That's the way it's all presented. The Wyrm is bad, period. Like corruption, pollution, all this stuff is horrible. But there is a moment where if you look at what the Wyrm's purpose is, and you go, wait, the Wyrm's goal is to destroy the things in the world that need to be destroyed, that need to be broken down, that need to go away. And why is that bad? Ultimately, it isn't. The Wyrm, as it was supposed to be in the universe, is good. But in the werewolf cosmology, the Weaver, the entity of stasis and control and building, went out of its way to trap the Wyrm and drove the Wyrm crazy, which has caused it to not be able to do its job correctly. But so then, like, the question there is the Weaver the ultimate enemy in Werewolf? Shouldn't werewolves be going after the Weaver because it's the Weaver's fault? Or is the Wyrm actually to blame in all of this?
Okay, so the idea is the Wyrm's original goal was to break things down. The Weaver drove it mad, and break things down turned into metaphysically tainting things without necessarily destroying them.
Right.
Now, so we've talked about the SPD in that you could have strange bedfellows of traditions wanting to do damage to the technocracy and werewolves wanting to do damage. Werewolf in my head is fundamentally not necessarily an urban game. Like, you always have the dichotomy that vampires get the city and werewolves get the countryside or something like that. I recognize that there's probably city werewolves and the country werewolves probably hate them. I don't know how this stuff works. Is it ever the case that werewolves will include outsiders to take out like some giant thing in the Umbra? Like, if I want an action-packed campaign where it's like, oh, you thought Strength 7 was amazing? Well, look at this bad motor scooter. Are there any tales of joint strike forces against it?
Yeah. One of the interesting things is that there can be a lot of overlap between the relatives of werewolves and mages. And what I mean by that are kinfolk, which are the people that are biologically related to werewolves but are not werewolves, tend to become mages more frequently than other human beings do.
Would they be considered at least sleepwalkers then? Like people, maybe they're not witnesses for the case of vulgar magic?
Correct.
So there is a sideways case, and I imagine there's a merit in Mage called like Werewolf Friend or whatever the heck that's called.
Supernatural Companion, I think, is the merit.
They used to have like a Fey blood thing. There was probably a werewolf blood thing where if you shit at a cairn, you get task back. I don't know. These systems in the 90s were weird.
Mm-hmm. I think it was the kinfolk merit, which is a 4-point merit.
Okay. So it's a case where we can come up with some cases where they're going to be friendly towards each other. Besides the whole cairn thing, are they ever going to be openly antagonistic? Like, for instance, are there fundamental cultural divides? Like, is there a way that the Garu see the world that may not comport with the way a mage sees the world? Like, do they have in the same way that, like, a Sons of Aether in general isn't going to care about how often you attend church? That's going to be super important to a more religiously focused faction. Are there fundamental differences in what attributes are important that may cause some cultural tension between a mage and a werewolf?
That's a really good question, and it's hard to answer.
So one of the things that comes to mind is the fact that from the few things I've read of werewolf, tribe is important. The werewolf without a tribe is more concerning in the way that an orphan may not be. Like, is there a term for a lone werewolf? Are they generally shunned?
A Ronin.
Okay.
Yes.
Really, we had to go with Ronin. Can't we use knight errant? Like,
well,
we
yeah.
have this thing in the West. Let's
Yeah.
not. Can't we stick with our own cultural baggage?
You'd think.
Anyway, yeah,
But
okay.
one of the problems with werewolf is the werewolves view themselves as an culture to humanity.
Okay.
So there's a lot of words in werewolf that are stolen. Like, I would even say appropriated from cultures in a way that's really inappropriate.
Okay.
And I say this as a person that runs a werewolf podcast and has to say these words on a regular basis. But the in-culture werewolf view is that we gave these words to humanity rather than the other way around.
That's our word. Great.
Yeah.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I could give like 7, but I'll give
let's
you
go with
3.
2. Oh, okay. 3. We'll go
I'll give
with
you 3.
Okay.
Because 3 I think are really appropriate. The first is metis.
Okay.
So there are werewolves that are born of 2 werewolves, which is considered a sin in werewolf society.
Awkward.
And that is a French word, métis, which also refers to a particular group of native people in French-speaking Canada.
Just look that up on dictionary.com.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
ooh. Offspring of an American Indian and a white person, especially one of French ancestry. That's awfully specific. And they're the misfits. How about that?
Yeah.
That's going to cause some problems.
It's a very problematic word. And there's no getting around that. Like,
Okay.
I don't know why it was chosen. I know why it was chosen, but it was really inappropriate.
Okay.
The other 2 that come to mind are the names of 2 tribes, the Octena and the Wendigo, who both of those are Native American words that are not supposed to be spoken out loud, period. Like, explicitly, when you talk about the W word, you're supposed to refer to it as a euphemism, ice heart or the, biting wind or anything like that. You're never supposed to speak of it by name because it will come and make your life hell.
That's the Arctic spirit. This is, maybe I shouldn't even try, but it's something cannibalism is involved in that. Okay.
It's a Manitou of cannibalism. That it's like a corrupting force that ultimately destroys people that get too greedy.
Oh, okay.
The other one, the Octena, is a water cougar spirit. But in werewolf, it's a like dragon serpent thing, which makes no sense.
An attractive older woman at a pool. Got it.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So there's all these layers to that, and it's a word that's not supposed to be spoken unless you're inducted into specific mysteries to be able to utilize it.
Okay.
So you have those problems. This is a long segue of there's some problems.
Oh, this is it's something fundamental to the game. But the interesting thing is, like in Mage in M20, there was a whole process where we're like, Dream Speakers may not be the best name. Sons of Ether, we should revise that. And there were a whole bunch of alternative terms that were proffered as a way of dealing with that. Did Werewolf have a similar update?
No, I wish they did. And this is like, if we have a 5th edition Werewolf, the language usage is one of the things that we would have to change for me to buy into it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because we don't need to use these words for these things. You know what I mean? Like, there are immediately better terms that we could create. Like, I could just make up wholesale right now that would be totally appropriate.
The big thing when doing a crossover is there are kind of levels of crossover. One is you're encountering another night folk, and I'm going to use the system for that night folk. And we went over a few cases for that. Is there a scenario where I might have a mixed group, where I would have a cabal and a background research? A sept is a group that defends a cairn?
Yes. It's kind of like a nation to a territory.
Okay, so a sept can be made up of multiple tribes.
Usually the members are of multiple tribes, yes.
Oh, okay, got it. So is there a case then where I would have maybe a tribe that worked very closely with a cabal? Like, what are some plot threads that if a storyteller is like, man, I really like the themes that you're hammering home, what are some options? Oh, and I also remembered what the previous question was. What are some fundamental cultural issues that a mage may deal with running into a werewolf? I look at the character sheet, and there's You got renown, glory, honor, wisdom. You got all sorts of John that I am not used to looking at.
Most of that are really like game terms that don't have like an in-game and in-world sort of impact on like that cultural sort of interaction. So weirdly, like I don't think that would be a core antagonistic plot that you could do unless it was something like, oh, we're doing a cabal of choristers and hermetics, and oh, these werewolves just have a totally different worldview than you. Like, yes, but I don't see that being good.
And they have to throw a dinner party togetger. Yeah, okay.
Right. Not a good plot necessarily.
The storyteller vault. Okay.
Oh, geez,
you're already writing it. Don't kid.
But the other question that you asked, which I think is a good one, is what sort of ways would we get these groups interacting with one another? One way that I have done it, that I'm doing right now, is a crossover Victorian era game. So this game has 3 mages and 1 werewolf and 1 revenant.
Do you literally have the Werewolves of London? Also, what is a revenant?
Revenant is a born vampire ghoul.
Okay.
That's the easiest way of describing. They're kind of like a daywalker.
Okay, and people complain about mage being too complicated. Anyway,
yes.
Carry on.
So the werewolf character in that is a Bonar. The Bonar are a urban tribe of werewolves. They tend to live in cities. They tend to associate with the poor elements of society when they live in cities. So they, I think, are one of the easier tribes to cross over. There are 3 tribes that I think are fairly easy to cross over to mage in different ways. Glasswalkers, the Bonars, and doesn't matter. We'll just stick with the Bonars and the Glasswalkers, and I'll forget the third one for now.
Silent Striders, Stargazers, Shadow Lords,
all
Fiona,
those are good.
White Howlers.
No, I don't know where I was going,
Bunyip.
Terry. Stop.
I did my homework.
You did. But the Bonars, I think, are a good crossover group because they're in the places mages will be. They're in the places where people are going to be. If I were to mix the two, one of the things that I would do is focus more on the spiritual stuff in some way that connects them all. So, for example, there could be a spiritual corruption in the center of the city that impacts a cabal of mages and maybe 1 or 2 werewolves really impactfully for different reasons. For example, like maybe the Liberty Bell is being attacked by
dumbasses with hammers.
Right. Well, maybe in the real world, but in the Umbra, there are spirits that are trying to corrupt the spirit of the Liberty Bell, which causes an impact to the nodes within Philadelphia, because all of the nodes are connected along a Freemason geometric link to the Liberty Bell.
Ley line?
Well, different from ley lines because they're constructed.
Okay. Laid lines.
Right. Yeah, that's a good term. And because of that, the Order of Hermes is losing control, like losing power in their node, and they see that the power is dissipating, but they can't get to where they need to be to fix it. The werewolves are concerned about it. They find some way to work with one another and kind of deconstruct what's happening with the Liberty Bell and all of its node connections.
Interesting. So the idea, again, making this corruption literal, something bad starts happening in an area that kind of reflects an underlying moral corruption. So one of the big things in World of Darkness games is when something really bad happens, it's almost always humans. Like we don't blame 9/11 on the Ventru, and we don't say the technocracy caused World War II. Supernatural powers only get involved once humans have started doing a thing. Is there ever a moment where you're like, this whole idea of metaphysical corruption is putting too much on the Wyrm?
Here's where it gets weird, because yes, that is exactly one of the bad, like you can go too far that direction where, the Wyrm is causing all the bad things in the world, or humanity does bad things and the Wyrm goes, okay, I'm going to move in on that. So you can go from it from 2 different angles. You can have it be completely human and that attracts Banes, the negative spirits of the Wyrm, or it is those things that are causing it. You can go either direction really easily.
That makes sense. So you've laid out, we have an urban chronicle where there is some sort of metaphysical taint, and we get a buddy cop drama, we go into the Umbra, plot ensues.
Maybe the werewolves go in the Umbra while the humans stay in the real world, and they have to coordinate between both layers of reality to
and
do
not
the
let
thing.
the beams cross. I understand. Okay.
Exactly.
Are there any other that come to mind?
It all depends on so many different factors, because you could do something like a classical Greek game, where the Black Furies, who are a group of Amazonian werewolves that only have female members, don't get into all of the problems that has. But perhaps they have an overlap with some of the classical Greek traditions, the Euthanatoi, the proto-hermetics, and different groups in that area. Even the proto-celestial chorus, if you kind of connect all of those, that could be a really interesting thing. Maybe in that, oh, hey, we have to cause an effect to occur that puts all of Greek philosophy at the forefront of this world that will be created in the future. I'm just tossing out random ideas, Terry. Perhaps there's a war. Let's use Toronto as Vancouver as an example.
Okay.
There's a war in Rage Across Vancouver, or Dark Vancouver, because it's both a werewolf and a vampire book.
So wouldn't it be like it's Canada? Wouldn't it just be like an unpleasantness across Vancouver? No? Okay.
No. Vancouver, in the world of darkness at least, is very, very bad.
Okay.
Vancouver's an interesting place in that there's a lot of organized crime there, but that's another story. There's a war brewing in the canon between werewolves and vampires in Vancouver. And perhaps mages see that this war is about to begin. Perhaps a really smart Cult of Ecstasy member takes some acid and goes into the time stream and realizes we have one chance to stop the destruction of the world.
Stop Thanos. Yeah, only one. Okay.
But maybe they have to make a deal between the werewolves and the vampires before this war goes out of control.
Now, from what I understand, the leeches versus the moondoggies, or whatever derogatory term you have for the werewolves, has gone back literally millennia. Mm-hmm. Is there an origin to that? Like, is that a opportunity for crossover where it's like, no one likes vampires? Like, in terms of the metaphysical trinity, are they kind of like the emblem of the Wyrm? Like, can a werewolf sniff out a vampire?
They think they can, because they've often will say, oh, that vampire is worm tainted, but that's mechanically not necessarily true. It's kind of written that way, but if you look at the rules, it's like, not necessarily so. The argument between vampires and werewolves is fairly ridiculous in that there is actually no reason for it. Vampires do almost nothing except maybe feed off of their kinfolk, which might bother them. But otherwise, vampires have almost no direct reason to be in conflict with werewolves, except they choose to be, because they're like, oh, I'm going to build something that will make me money where this cairn is, and then the werewolves get pissed at me, even though I had no idea that their magic temple was there.
They are theoretically at each other's throats, but it's one of those things where it's everyone is the lead in their own story, that right. Everyone represents a opposing force that they can wipe the floor with to prove how potent they are, or what have you.
That being said, that did give me an idea of a Tremere werewolf mage crossover, which could be a thing.
So for our audience, who are the Tremere?
The Tremere are a set of vampires that used to be members of the Order of Hermes back in the Middle Ages and became vampires because they're smart.
Yes. I did find out recently, though, that the Tremere, the term comes from tremble, and that was literally from Tremere himself being so afraid of death that he would kind of work himself. Like, I never got the whole fear of death when you're a mage thing. Like, you have an avatar. Like, there's a cycle of rebirth. Like, those are the people, like, I don't get why the Euthanatoi are so sad. Like, you literally know that there is a cycle of rebirth. Like, of people who should be concerned about, like, oh, someone's dead, there's dead. Like, I mean, to me, that's the equivalent of someone popping your balloon. You can get another balloon. But maybe I'm just a sociopath and fail to understand it. Or maybe I'm dealing with my own mortality in a very outward, angry way, but like of people to be like, shit, like the people who are like, yeah, we can see the wheel of creation. Like, I have a pair of binoculars. I look at it every morning. They would be the ones least likely to fear. I'm just putting that out there. You
would think, but then there's a sense of loss of who you are with that. You are not the same person any longer once that happens.
I'm not the same person. Like, but
because the avatar is from canon. The avatar is not the same as the being that they are connected to.
Yeah, and it's not the same with the soul, which is why things get derpy over time, and that's how you answer the question of like, but there's more people than they used to be. How do we don't answer that one, Mr. Smarty?
To me, though, that said, I don't think the avatar is separate from the mage. That is one of the things, like, from when I run the game, the avatar is not a separate being that just attaches itself to a human. I dislike that, and I know lots of mage fans will yell at me for that, but it's just not one thing I've ever gotten into.
It's a total legit way of doing it. I feel like I so thoroughly loved the Avatar Storm plotline and the idea of the Anakim and the Psychopomps that Avatar are fundamentally alien and that they join up with a mage. And it is not quite as separate as maybe a Wraith and their shadow, but it's close. Like, I give my characters essentially avatar powers that whenever a mage does something magically reflexively, it's the avatar keeping an eye out for things. It's a very limited form of mage sight, a la Mage the Awakening. But yeah, it is a knob that storytellers can put anywhere, and as long as they're consistent with it, I am entirely fine with it.
I'm trying not to say anything negative about that plot. I really disliked it.
Go nuts. The Avatar Storm in general, like, did the Avatar Storm affect the Garu?
Only a little bit, in that it made the Umbra harder to get into, which the revised books did address. They were like, the Umbra seems to be harder to, like, enter now than it used to be, which I think was just them going, wow, people go into the Umbra too often. We need to adjust that a little bit, make it harder. That said, I want to go in a different direction than bitching about the revised mage meta plot, which, like, I want to be on board with. There were parts of it I liked, but the Avatar Storm and the Psychopomps and Ascension, the book, really, like, I was like, no, these are not the parts of mage I like. But what I do find interesting is this idea of, okay, mages are different because they are separate from the spirit. That is an interesting metaphysical hook for werewolf, where werewolves are the spirit as well as this physical entity. Mages are a spirit connected to a human. Maybe that could be something that would be an interesting plot to dive into and disconnect.
Do the wolf half and the human half fight?
No. See, this is where it gets weird, because because werewolves are a ethnic group or ethnic groups, in that they have wolf relatives and human relatives.
Oh, that's got to be awkward at Christmas.
Yeah. You're like, your Uncle Jim is a bastard. He's eating all the steaks. It's like, yeah, he's a wolf.
I will have your entire half of the family neutered.
There's a lot of weird, like, social stuff there, but not internally necessarily. The fight inside a werewolf is between their spirit and their rage. Those two forces being in opposition, but also trying to find a common goal for both of them.
Okay, so you have a fight between I'ma break shit and maybe breaking shit ain't the best way of dealing with this problem?
Yeah, and maybe, like, breaking shit actually hurts the world.
Picking up what you're putting down. So I think we did a pretty good job of addressing how it could interface with Mage. Are there any other bits of the world that you think are super interesting, or things that you find endlessly fascinating? And how do you sell people on Werewolf?
So I usually sell people on Werewolf, depending on which direction they come in, either one of two ways. The first being that this is a spiritual game that looks at the world, looks at an animist world and says, what is behind the curtain that drives it, and what can we learn from that? At the same time, what do we do when we can take direct action against all the bad things in the world and take the fight to them, rather than being scared of engaging with all of the problematic elements of the world that we see around us? So I often will seed people the idea of werewolf and, like, hey, we get to go beat up, the bourgeoisie tonight. And people are like, sweet, tear down the man. And I'm like, all right. And then layer in all of the spirituality elements, and or bring people in from the spiritual and, like, tie in the combat and the war and the fighting as a way of protecting the spiritual and the natural.
So is there literally a spirit of the bourgeoisie? Like, is there the gap? Yeah. Is there the gap incarnate somewhere out there? Or
Almighty Dollar is a totem that you can interact with. That is a literal spirit.
Huh. Is that the same as, like, the totems a mage can get, where they have an umbral entity that grants them a boon or what have you?
Yes.
It's not like a werewolf version of like a team mascot or anything. Good to know.
Well, in some ways it is, because packs have their own totem.
Okay.
But it's a spirit that gives them those specific powers.
Do you ever get like a low draw from the deck and you're like, our totem is squirrel or our totem is okapi?
Squirrel is actually a really good totem, but yes, because when you create a pack in Werewolf Society, the pack goes out and searches out who their totem will be. You might end up with a totem that is on the surface lame, but will probably give you some good benefits.
Okay, so there is a Werewolf Sorting Hat. That's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any super lame ones? Did they release any like fake ones ever for?
Oh,
like,
geez.
is there?
Yes.
Can you have a sloth totem or?
Sloth is a totem.
Nice.
I'm trying to think of like hummingbird is a totem. Tsetse fly, no joke. Geez, there are a lot of really ridiculous totems that have been written over the years.
Thank you so much for the tour of Werewolf. Do you have any comments on any projects that you're working on, or where people can find out more about Werewolf the Apocalypse if they wish?
If one were to be interested in finding out more about me and what High Level Games is doing, I would recommend first going to Drive Through RPG and looking up Archons of Nikud, which is Nikud, which is our newest Savage Worlds Jumpstart, or a game that I am involved in writing that I think you will really enjoy. It's anthropomorphic animals in a time of tumult who are very deep. I've taken a lot of things I've learned from White Wolf over the years and to help us write that book.
You can listen to Mage the Ascension, the podcast, Mage the Podcast. I'm so good at this. On Spotify, directly at anchor.fm. Visit us at magethepodcast.com. Email us at magethepodcast@gmail.com if you are offended by my backhanded statements about werewolves and you want to challenge me to a duel at a moot with a glaive in the Umbra with a bane near a glen. You can do that, or tweet at Mage the Podcast and keep the conversation going. Josh, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Terry. I really appreciate it.